The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 4, the chair may postpone further proceedings on approving any measures or matter or adopting an amendment. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously circulated address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, staff, and all others physically present in this room, per guidance from the Office of Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's markup. Please also sanitize your seating area. The chair views these measures as a safety issue and therefore on an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House rules, staff will only mute members as appropriate and when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and as members were notified, we intend to consider 12 measures and their amendments en bloc. Pursuant to notice, for purposes of markup, I now call up the measures and their amendments that were previously circulated to members' offices, which, without objection, will be considered en bloc, and each measure is considered as read, and the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. Without objection, after remarks, the committee will vote to order the measures favorably reported en bloc, as amended if amended, and each amendment or amendments to each bill shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. The 12 measures in the en bloc package are H.R. 1488, Global Electoral Exchange Act of 2021, with a Castro amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 1036, Bassam Barabandi Rewards for Justice Act. H.R. 402, CROOK Act. H.R. 2538, FENTANYL Results Act. H.Res. 186, calling for the immediate release of Trevor Reed, a United States citizen who was unjustly found guilty and sentenced to 9 years in a Russian prison. H.R. 2471, Haiti Development, Accountability, and Institutional Transparency Initiative Act, with a Meeks amendment in the nature of a substitute and amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute from Perry and Jacobs. H.R. 1228, Libya Stabilization Act, with a Deutsch amendment in the nature of a substitute and amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute from Mayer and Liu. H.R. 496, Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act. H.R. 826, Divided Families Reunification Act. H.Res. 294, Encouraging Reunions of Divided Korean American Families. H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. H.Res. 317, condemning the ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity being committed against the Uyghurs and members of the other religious and ethnic minority groups by the People's Republic of China, with the McCall Amendment. And I recognize myself to speak on the en bloc passage. The measures in the en bloc demonstrate the strengths of this committee. These bills and resolutions are bipartisan. They cover regions all around the globe and reflect this committee's focus on human rights and good governance. They reflect not only upon this committee's expertise and knowledge, but also its ability to work across the aisle on the toughest issues of the day, and I want to thank the ranking member for just that. Indeed, few matters are more difficult to address than the current situation in Xinjiang, China. Despite attempts to cover up the atrocities of by Chinese authorities, it has become clear that the ongoing abuses committed against the Uyghurs and the people in Xinjiang amount to a genocide as defined by the Geneva Convention. The reports I have read and heard from survivors are truly harrowing, and I'm proud to have worked closely with Ranking Member McCall on his resolution and applaud him for his leadership and courage on this issue. Chair McGovern's legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, adds further bite to this committee's response. H. 1155 prohibits the import of goods and merchandise from Xinjiang and imposes sanctions on officials facilitating the use of forced labor against Chinese ethnic minorities and calls for a diplomatic strategy to address forced labor in the region. Let me further state this about these Uyghur measures. I do believe it is the duty of this committee to account for commercial, business, economic, and environmental and strategic considerations with each bill we pass. But ultimately, we cannot compromise on our core values or cast asunder our most cherished principles. The United States and the People's House have a duty to lead on these difficult issues, and we will not turn our backs on this solemn responsibility. Our en-bloc measures today also enact a number of serious and significant good governance reforms. Representative Keating's important legislation, the CROOK Act, would levy an additional penalty on the most egregious violators of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and use these fines to create an anti-corruption action fund. Representative Castro's Global Electoral Exchange will encourage best practices for election administration around the world, a sorely needed antidote in 2021. Representative Trone's FENTANYL Results Act will likewise encourage greater diplomatic focus on a scourge that is affecting many communities here at home in the United States. Representative Wilson's bill, H.R. 1036, would expand the State Department's whistleblower rewards program to include sanctions violations. And we have seen the importance of the whistleblowers over the last decade. And Mr. Wilson's bill will help ensure that our foreign policy is not only carefully crafted, but effectively enforced. I also want to commend Representative Wilson for his Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act, as well as Representative Pfluger for his resolution calling for the immediate release of Trevor Reed, an American citizen who was sentenced to 9 years in Russian prison camp on bogus charges. These bills concern the failure of Vladimir Putin's Russia to follow international law abroad or install due process of law inside of Russia. Let me also thank my friend and Brooklyn brother, Chair of the Democratic Caucus, Hakeem Jeffries, for his vital bill, the Haiti Development, Accountability, and Institutional Transparency Initiative Act. Last month, we had our first full committee hearing in over a decade concerning our island neighbor, Haiti. This bill exemplifies that discussion, and I'm proud to bring up this measure today. And finally, let me acknowledge the important work of Representative Ming, who shares the borough of Queens with me, on the Divided Families Reunification Act, and Representative Karen Bass for her resolution encouraging reunions of divided Korean American families. The issue of divided Korean families has been present on the Korean Peninsula and in America for over 7 decades now. And I have personally heard the heart-rending stories from families who seek to see their loved ones. Each of these measures in the en bloc represent our principles, and underscore our priorities. And I'm proud to support all of them. I now yield to the Ranking Member McCall for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Meeks, for having this markup today, and once again, in a bipartisan manner. And I want to thank you for working with me and the staff. I commend the whole team, honoring the the traditions of this committee. I'd like to start today by discussing an issue very close to my heart and very close to the hearts of many Americans. Today we are considering a resolution introduced by Mr. Pfluger, a good Texan, and myself, calling for the release of Trevor Reed, also a good Texan, who is still being held as a political pawn, a political prisoner in Russia. Trevor is a 29-year-old Texas resident and former United States Marine who served his country with distinction. He is not a criminal, yet the Putin regime is treating him like he is one, sentencing him to 9 years in a Russian prison for a crime he did not commit. I've met with Trevor's family on several occasions, and you can see the heartbreak written all over their faces. All they want is to get their son home. As a father of 5, I cannot imagine being in their shoes, and I've been told the Reed family is actually watching this markup as I speak. And I want to let them know that the United States Congress will not rest, and I personally will not rest until he has been safely reunited with you. I want to thank my colleague from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for introducing this resolution, and Chairman, for your support, and help is going to be on the way. In fact, Mr. Pfluger and I spoke with the Secretary of State at our Afghanistan briefing on this very issue to raise it to his attention. I also want to thank my good friend Joe Wilson for his tireless efforts on the Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act and his Rewards for Justice bill. Both measures I've been very supportive of, and I'm pleased they are being considered today. Also proud to be the lead Republican on Mr. Trone's bill, formerly on this committee, the FENTANYL Results Act, and I appreciate his work on this important issue affecting so many Americans. Let's get it passed. Let's get it to the Senate, and let's hope the Senate does their job and passes it as well. Lastly, I want to thank you, Chairman Meeks, and your staff for working with me for months on a resolution of great importance, condemning the genocide being committed by the People's Republic of China under the direction and control of the Chinese Communist Party. I would call everyone's attention to the photos being shown on the screen. It is horrific. This is actually happening in China today, under the direction and control of the Chinese Communist Party against the Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minority groups. The photos you're seeing on the screen in the hearing room right now show the horrific truth of this genocide. Hundreds of Uyghurs being marched off trains, shackled, blindfolded, and led into internment camps. It's a chilling reminder of the true nature of the CCP's genocide. I understand there's been some debate on this, but to be clear, this is not a nuanced legal issue. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide clearly states that a genocide is acting with the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, racial, or religious group. So let's just look at the facts. More than 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities have been detained by the CCP. There are multiple credible reports these innocent people are being subjected to forced labor, forced sterilization and abortions, torture, family separation, sexual abuse, and family members have reported disappearances and even deaths. CCP officials have portrayed Uyghurs as, quote, malignant tumors, unquote. They've compared their faith to a quote, communicable plague. And they said, quote, you can't uproot all the weeds hidden among the crops. You simply need to kill them all. It is disgusting. It is truly horrific. Secretaries Pompeo and Blinken have each said that genocide is occurring in the PRC. And in the last several months, Canada's parliament and the Dutch parliament have done the same. In the United States, in the United Kingdom's House of Commons will vote tomorrow on this issue. So it is time, Mr. Chairman, thank you for working with me. It's time the United States Congress steps up and speaks out against the genocide and crimes against humanity being committed by the CCP. We have a moral obligation today and tomorrow to recognize these crimes for what they really are, genocide. The Chinese Communist Party is watching closely what we are doing here today. And in fact, the world is watching. I urge everyone to support this important resolution so we can send a strong bipartisan message that the United States stands against a genocide anywhere, everywhere, and it stands against human rights abuses. We stand for freedom and democracy. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. Because of the hybrid virtual format of this markup, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans for the purposes of speaking on the en bloc package. If you miss your turn to speak on the en bloc, please let our staff know, and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphones and address the chair verbally. I now recognize Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. McCall, for your eloquence on the Uyghurs. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. Regular markups, I think, are key to your goal in revitalizing this committee and its critical importance in the United States Congress. If I could, I'd like to bring attention to 3 particular items. I support the en bloc, of course. One is the Divided Families Reunification Act for Korean families. And we're going on 70 years of some families who were divided by an arbitrary line after World War II and after the Korean War, and the cruelty of the regime in the North in preventing families from even visiting each other. Now whole generations have missed birth and death. And for the Korean culture particularly, this is a horrible open wound and unnatural. And anything we can do to try to help in that regard will be profoundly appreciated in the Korean community here in the United States and certainly in the Korean Peninsula itself. Mr. McCall has brought a level of attention and eloquence to the Uyghur genocide, and we have 2 resolutions, H.R. 1155 and H.Res. 317. And I can't add to what Mr. McCall said because he said it so profoundly, but I will say this is another example where this committee has to be the place that is willing to speak truth to power. We have a bill on Saudi dissidents today on the floor. I hope will pass on a bipartisan basis overwhelmingly to deliver the same message to another government. China is important. China is going to overtake the United States this decade in being the world's largest economy. But it must be held to account. It must follow international rubrics and basic human rights that are enshrined in the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations. Protecting the Uyghurs, speaking on their behalf, is a responsibility this committee has. And we're meeting that responsibility today and passing these 2 important pieces of legislation. And finally, Mr. Chairman, the H.R. 1488, Global Electoral Exchange Act, you mentioned my role in NATO Parliamentary Assembly, but I've made, as a cornerstone of my presidency, enshrining shared democratic values in the alliance with equal status in terms of commitment to collective security. If we don't stand for shared democratic values, then we're just another military bloc. There's a reason we have the alliance, and that reason is that we come together around democratic principles. And this bill is consistent with that ethos and that message. And I think especially after recent events here in the nation's capital, we collectively need to be reinforcing that message and our commitment to those shared democratic values and processes. And so I think this takes on added significance, and I am so glad to see it on the agenda today. Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for your leadership. Mr. McCall, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the spirit in which you've approached this markup and other markups. And I look forward to seeing you both on the floor to pass our Saudi Protection of Dissidents bill later today. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Connolly yields back. I now recognize Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who is the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member McCall. This is an excellent block of bills. Hopefully, all of them become law. And so I want to thank you for putting these on the docket for today. I'd like to speak to one, especially H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was introduced by Jim McGovern and I. This bill will prohibit the importation of goods made with forced labor in Xinjiang, China. I would remind my colleagues, and I'm sure you all remember, it passed in the last Congress by a vote of 406-3. Never got out of the Senate. This act creates a, quote, rebuttable presumption that any goods made in Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region are made with forced labor and prohibited from entering the United States unless a clear and convincing evidence is shown to the contrary. As my colleagues know, it's estimated that up to 1.8 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other predominantly Muslim ethnic minorities have been arbitrarily detained in a system of extrajudicial internment camps where they are subjected to forced labor, torture, and political indoctrination. The cruelty is absolutely numbing, and it's all being done at the direction of Xi Jinping. Congress must hold the Chinese government accountable and give a strong voice to the millions of Muslim Uyghurs who are victims of genocide, rape, torture, forced abortion, and involuntary sterilization, re-education camps, and other gross violations of human rights. Mr. Chairman, Chinese authorities have had the audacity to deny the very existence of mass internment camps and portray them as vocational training centers. What a lie. What a despicable lie. The Chinese Communist Party continues to censor and use economic coercion to stifle discussion of its crimes, particularly overseas. Beijing, which hates and harasses all faiths, has instituted plans to erase the very existence of Islam in Western China. The CCP has bulldozed mosques and shrines, severely and unjustly inhibiting the religious practice of Islam and forcing camp detainees to actually renounce their faith. Our legislation is desperately needed. There's so many goods that are being made in those forced those factories with forced labor are showing up in our stores and on our shelves. So we need to show support for the suffering Uyghur community in China. Passage of this bill is another step in that direction. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Smith yields back. I now recognize Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, for holding this markup. I want to express my support for all the measures we'll consider today, particularly the Bassam Barabandi Rewards for Justice Act, which I co-introduced with Middle East Subcommittee Ranking Member Wilson, that will help strengthen our ability to crack down on U.S. and UN sanctions violators. Also, as a member who has spent considerable time advocating for the release of Americans held abroad, including my own constituent, Bob Levinson. I want to express my solidarity with Trevor Reed and his family. I want to thank Representative Pfluger for introducing this resolution and calling on the Russian government to immediately release him and any other Americans wrongfully detained. I also think it's especially important that we advance the Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act, which sends an unmistakable signal of our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in light of Russia's military buildup and ongoing aggression in Ukraine. I strongly support Mr. McGovern's Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the Meeks-McCall resolution condemning the Chinese government's systematic oppression of Uyghurs. I hope this committee will also consider my Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act in the coming months, which would also assist Uyghurs threatened by Chinese government repression, making it easier for them to seek asylum here in the United States. I share the concerns that the chair has expressed over the current situation in Haiti, and as a representative of South Florida, I thank him for his leadership and thank Representative Jeffries for putting forward today's legislation. I know that this issue hits close to home for so many in the Haitian diaspora. The Haitian people deserve accountability from their government. They deserve to have a free and fair electoral process, and they deserve the full support of the United States. Finally, I'd like to thank the chairman and ranking member for marking up the Libya Stabilization Act, which I introduced with Mr. Wilson, Mr. Liu, and Mr. Malinowski. The bill passed the House last Congress, but did not advance in the Senate, and I am hopeful that with our committee advancing the legislation early this Congress, and with a new administration and new majority in the Senate, it will pass into law this year. Since October, Libya has experienced a ceasefire, diplomacy, and a domestic political dialogue that have brought increased security to all Libyans. A new unified interim government was inaugurated in March and will govern Libya until free, fair, inclusive, and credible elections are held in December. These are important accomplishments. Credit should be given to the Libyan people and participants in the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, as well as the UN and U.S. Embassy in Libya for these achievements. And while I'm heartened by these developments and the Biden-Harris administration's renewed focus on Libya, the situation remains tenuous. More than 500,000 migrants remain in Libya. Human rights abuses continue. Furthermore, progress on securing the withdrawal of foreign weapons, forces, and mercenaries from Libya remains elusive. Thousands of foreign fighters are still in Libya despite repeated international agreements and the October 2020 ceasefire calling for their removal. The presence of these forces aggravates the conflict, exacerbates humanitarian and human rights abuses, and undermines Libyan sovereignty. Therefore, our legislation imposes targeted sanctions on individuals who violate the arms embargo and support foreign military intervention and militias that threaten the peace, security, and stability of Libya. The bill demonstrates Congress's interest in ending foreign intervention and consolidating Libya's political gains both before and after the December elections. These initiatives, removing foreign forces and helping Libyans rebuild their country, will encourage long-term peace and stability in Libya. Thanks again to Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall for marking up this bill and all of the important pieces of legislation that we will consider today. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Deutsch yields back. I now recognize Representative Steve Shabbat from Ohio, who's the ranking member on the Subcommittee of Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and the Non-Proliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and commend you and the ranking member, McCall, for continuing to work together in a bipartisan manner and getting so many pieces of legislation across the finish line, at least of this committee. Hopefully we'll get them through the Senate, get them to the President's desk, but I want to thank both of you. We have a lot of good bills today. I want to focus on just 2 of them because of the shortness of time. First, I'd like to discuss the Libya Stabilization Act. Since Gaddafi was toppled, that country has been in some level of chaos. Fortunately, things may be calming down now as a political solution moves forward, but there's still a long way to go. This legislation should help the administration fulfill the U.S. role as an honest broker seeking peace in this long-suffering, war-torn country. I want to also raise the human trafficking situation in Libya, and I'd like to thank Mr. Deutsch for including provisions on human trafficking in his substitute amendment, which I authored when this committee last worked on the bill. In its March 2021 monthly update on Libya, the International Organization for Migration reported that there are approximately 570,000 migrants in Libya, in addition to hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons. The existing conditions that these people face are absolutely terrible. Torture, malnutrition, violence, and other forms of human rights abuse are common, and there's no place to flee. Many of these migrants are on their way from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe with the hope of building a better life there. Along the way, they are often caught up in networks of human traffickers that exploit them in the most horrific ways. This includes modern-day slavery, or some equivalent, in which Africans are essentially bought and sold or treated like animals, and women face rape and forced prostitution. The provisions that I authored make it the policy of the United States to seek an end to forced labor, sexual exploitation, and even what amounts to slavery in Libya, and addresses these crimes. The least we can do for these very vulnerable people is to use what leverage we have to help resolve this deplorable situation. I'd also like to voice my strong support for H.Res. 317, which condemns the People's Republic of China's genocide against the Uyghurs. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this legislation. I want to commend, again, Ranking Member McCall and you, Mr. Chairman, for your work on bringing it and this critical issue before this committee. As Ranking Member, as you mentioned, of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee, I monitor the Chinese Communist Party particularly closely, and the atrocities committed against the Uyghurs are completely out of bounds for a country like China that likes to consider itself civilized. As I mentioned, in Libya, people face unspeakable abuses that are perpetuated by unscrupulous men preying on weak and desperate people. In Xinjiang, however, we see many of the same abuses, and they are being deliberately planned and perpetrated by the state. The PRC subjects Uyghurs to forced labor, torture, sexual abuse, indoctrination, religious persecution, and onerous restrictions in every aspect of their lives. Over 1 million are in concentration camps. The Chinese Communist Party is transferring Uyghur children from their parents, imposing severe birth quotas for Uyghurs, and conducting forced abortions. Perhaps most telling, the Chinese Communist Party has sought to sterilize or enforce long-term involuntary contraception on a sizable percentage of the population, up to 80% in some areas of Xinjiang. As a result of all of this, the birth rate in Xinjiang fell by 24% in 2019. One can destroy a people by preventing the next generation from being born. This is without a doubt what the Chinese Communist Party is attempting to do. This is genocide. If we do not stand up today and be the voices for the voiceless, we will be judged harshly. And I want to thank again this entire committee on both sides of the aisle for stepping up, and let's continue to push forward on this tragic, tragic issue. I'd urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Bill Keating of Massachusetts, the chair of the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, and the Environment and Cyber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this markup. I associate myself with the comments and support for the bipartisan legislations going forward. I particularly like to thank members of the committee for their support in dealing with the CROOK Act. I'm honored to partner with my colleague, Mr. Fitzpatrick, to offer the Countering Russian and Other Overseas Kleptocracy Act, or the CROOK Act. This important piece of legislation is the latest in our efforts to counter Russia's ceaseless, malign global influences and to send a strong message to all authoritarian states that actions that weaken democratic governments feed terrorist recruitment and transnational organized crime, enable drug smuggling and unconscionable human trafficking, and stymie economic growth will not be tolerated. The CROOK Act will establish an anti-corruption action fund to assist governments and non-governmental organizations in their efforts to prevent, investigate, and combat corruption and bribery. It'll establish an interagency task force to work with U.S. embassies to coordinate assistance efforts, promote good governments in foreign states, and enhance and evaluate the ability of foreign states to combat public corruption. It'll also designate embassy anti-corruption points of contact to support an interagency approach to combat public corruption. The CROOK Act is recognized as a vital tool in the fight against corruption and enjoys widespread bipartisan support, bicameral support, and civil society support. I thank the members of the committee, and I urge their support of the CROOK Act. I yield back.
No. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, who is the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Greg Meeks and Ranking Member Mike McCall, for bringing these important bipartisan measures before us today, including 2 bills I sponsored and passed the House last year. While each of these bills before us today represents the bipartisan spirit of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm grateful to speak in support of the following measures. First, I would like to thank the committee for marking up H.R. 496, which I reintroduced with my good friend and fellow Helsinki Commission member, Emmanuel Cleaver. Russia's aggression in Ukraine and illegal occupation of Crimea have dragged on for nearly 8 years. The human toll is staggering and needs to be understood. The fighting has killed over 10,000 soldiers and more than 3,000 innocent civilians. Another casualty of Russian aggression in Ukraine has been the attack on religious freedom. Russian authorities in Crimea illegally continue to persecute and intimidate the minority Christian, Muslim, and other religious groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses. This bill upholds the United States' commitment to promote religious freedom and protect religious minorities around the globe by bringing international attention to the grave violations of religious freedom in the territory of free Ukraine, where, again, people need to know more than 13,000 people have been killed due to the aggression. This legislation helps ensure that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are held accountable. I thank the Helsinki Commission for championing this issue and will always be grateful for our late colleague, Chairman Alcee Hastings' commitment to global human rights. I would also like to thank the committee for marking up H.R. 1036, which I reintroduced with Chairman Ted Deutsch. This bill would expand the Rewards for Justice program at the State Department to authorize awards for individuals coming forward with information on sanctions, evasions, and practices. The bill was inspired by Bassam Barabandi, a courageous Syrian defector and former diplomat at the Syrian embassy in Washington, who worked with anti-regime activists to provide passports to critics of the criminal Assad regime. For years after his defection, Bassam, a true Syrian patriot, has lobbied the U.S. government with information on Syrian oligarchs close to Assad and their sanctions evasion practices. Bassam's case highlighted the need to create a clear mechanism to incentivize individuals to come forward with that kind of vital information. H.R. 1036 will do just that and ultimately enhance compliance with U.S. and international sanctions, increase confidence in the rule of law, and bring criminals and rogue regimes seeking to circumvent U.S. law to justice. Additionally, I'd like to speak in favor of H.R. 1228, sponsored by Chairman Ted Deutsch, which I'm grateful to be a lead co-sponsor. This bill promotes democracy and stability for the people of Libya and holds outside actors accountable for malign interference. I am grateful for this legislation to be included in the markup. And lastly, I want to thank Ranking Member Mike McCall, Chairman Greg Meeks, and Chairman Jim McGovern, and Ranking Member Chris Smith for their commitment to holding the Chinese Communist Party accountable for the atrocities committed against the Uyghurs and other minorities. Both H.R. 1155 and House Resolution 317 reaffirmed the United States' commitment to supporting religious freedom and protecting religious minorities from exploitation and persecution. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I yield back.
Representative Wilson yields back. I now recognize Representative Karen Bass of California, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Need to turn up the volume here. Today, Representative Young Kim and I welcome your support on a very important bipartisan resolution, H.Res 294, encouraging reunions of divided Korean American families. This resolution, which was first introduced in the 115th and 16th Congress and passed unanimously, focuses on the institution of family and prioritizes the reunion of Korean Americans with relatives in North Korea, acknowledging that 10 million Korean families were separated in 1953 at the end of the Korean War. This resolution supports the tens of thousands of Korean American families who lost contact with relatives in North Korea almost 70 years ago. This resolution also recognizes that the government of South Korea and North Korea organized 21 rounds of family reunifications between 1985 and 2018 that reunited approximately 40,000 families and seeks to provide ways in which Korean American families can enjoy similar benefits. Both Representative Kim and I have constituents who share horrific stories of being divided from family members for nearly 70 years. They recount the difficulties of separation that have been exacerbated by the challenges of the lack of information and the inability to communicate with relatives living in North Korea. We're also thankful for the activism and work of advocacy groups like the Korean American Grassroots Conference and others like the leadership of a member of my staff, Kenneth Ahn, who led the effort to get this resolution on our agenda in Washington, D.C. However, it remains unfortunate that American diplomatic overtures, congressional action, and high-level engagements in 2018 and 19 have failed to develop formal channels to reunify divided Korean American families. Therefore, the encouraging reunions of divided Korean American families resolution is an effort to rectify this gap by calling on the U.S. and North Korea to immediately begin the process of reuniting Korean American divided family members with their immediate relatives by identifying divided families in the U.S. and North Korea who are willing and able to participate in a pilot program for family reunions, finding matches for members of such families through organizations such as the Red Cross, and working with the government of South Korea to include American citizens in inter-Korean video reunions. H.R. 294 is meant to complement and support other legislative efforts to reunite Korean Americans with family members in North Korea, such as the Divided Families Reunification Act, a bipartisan bill introduced by Representatives Gray Ming and Van Taylor, which I fully support. The unintended consequences of the Korean War have led to the division of Korean American families in the U.S. and North Korea. Hopefully, COVID-19 has helped us better appreciate life in connection with family, and we must increase our efforts to reunite divided Korean American families. Your support of this resolution could rectify this tragedy and bring peace of mind and happiness to many of our fellow Americans. We appreciate your support of H.R. 294, encouraging reunions of divided Korean American families. I would also urge your support of Representative Ming's bipartisan bill, H.R. 826, requiring the State Department to report to Congress on its consultations with South Korea on opportunities to reunite families in North and South Korea. And let me just say that a couple of years ago, a gentleman, an elder from the community, he was clearly in his late 70s or 80s, came in my office and in tears talked about how he didn't know if his brothers and sisters were still alive. He knew he had lost his parents, and to please give him the opportunity to see his siblings before his time comes. Thank you, and I ask for your support. I yield back the balance of my time.
Representative Bass yields back. I now recognize Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm especially proud to support House Resolution 317, which condemns the Chinese Communist Party for their brutal campaign of genocide against the Uyghurs and other ethnic minority groups. What we are seeing in China is a systematic attempt to destroy these ethnic groups, and it shows the brutality and inhumanity of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party has incarcerated over 1 million Uyghurs and have forced many into work camps where they are essentially tortured. Additionally, the Chinese Communist Party even feels like they have the impunity to force the Uyghur women to have abortions and have forced the sterilization of many more. The Chinese Communist Party needs to be held accountable and punished for their reprehensible actions. I urge my colleagues to support House Resolution 317. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Burchett yields back. I now recognize Representative David Cicilline of Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks, and thanks to Ranking Member McCall for holding this markup today as we consider diverse, important legislation that affords this committee the opportunity to stand against illicit international finance, to chart a new path forward for Libya and its people by dissuading foreign interference in that country, and to raise awareness of the ongoing genocide against the Uyghur population of China. The weight of these issues cannot be overstated, and I'm grateful to the chairman and the ranking member for the opportunity to discuss them today. Before doing that, I want to address an issue we are also considering as part of the agenda today that has plagued our districts for far too long and has caused such harm in my home state. In fact, 73% of all deaths caused from drug overdoses last year in Rhode Island involved fentanyl. Too many lives have been lost, too many families have been torn apart, and too many communities have been impacted by fentanyl and the disease of addiction. We know that addiction can touch the lives of anyone. No socioeconomic background provides immunity. I'm encouraged that we have the opportunity on this committee to consider a bill, H.R. 2538, to combat the international trafficking of fentanyl into the United States and to help rid this menace from our communities. The Uyghur population in China has been subjected to crimes against humanity that amount to genocide. There is no graver crime, no more grievous an act, and the weight of history demands that this committee take all the actions within our power to raise awareness of these atrocities that the Uyghurs are being forced to endure. The birth rate amongst the Uyghur population has declined at a rate of 6 times that of the rest of China. That's a consequence of Chinese government policies that force sterilization, force abortions, and force unwanted marriages to ethnically cleanse the region of the Uyghurs. Never again must truly mean never again. I encourage my colleagues on this committee to support House Resolution 317. Since the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, the Libyan people have lived under the yoke of a failed state. Governance, human rights, and basic services have been left in shambles, and the gaps have, for too long, been filled by international actors seeking to further their own geopolitical aims without consideration of the people of Libya. After years of turmoil and tumult, without any meaningful progress in improving governing structures in Libya, and with elections slated for this year, I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 1228 so that the people of Libya might finally have the opportunity to chart their own path forward. Upwards of $2 trillion in illicit funds, largely from bad actors like Russia and China, flood the international system annually through money laundering, tax abuse, and transnational financial crimes. These funds fuel instability, worsen inequality, weaken public institutions and the public trust, and siphon resources away from development abroad, all in the name of corruption. The ramifications of inaction have led to a greater exacerbation of the problem. We must demand greater accountability and greater transparency in combating illicit international finance, and this legislation will help us do so. And I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 402 so that we may advance greater cooperation among our partners abroad and begin to curtail the deeply corrupt practices that have festered for far too long around the globe and benefited authoritarian leaders. Once again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup, and I yield back.
Representative Cicilline yields back. I now recognize Representative August Pfluger of Texas, who is the vice-ranking member for the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, the Environment, and Cyber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McCall, for an important hearing today. And before I get into the main issue, I'd also like to express my support for H.R. 317, condemning the genocide against the Uyghur population. And I appreciate this committee being committed to that. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the support of the resolution calling for the immediate release of Trevor Reed in today's markup. Trevor is my constituent from Granbury, Texas. He's an Eagle Scout, a U.S. Marine veteran, and more importantly, a beloved son who was sentenced to spend a decade of his life in a Russian prison for a crime that he did not commit. Trevor was initially detained for public intoxication, but when the Russian Federal Security Service discovered that he is a U.S. Marine veteran, they upped the charges and accused him, wrongfully accused him, of endangering the lives of police officers. These charges were clearly politically motivated, and the entire process has been bogus. The accusation and the lack of evidence to support it was so ridiculous that even the Russian judge erupted in laughter during his trial. U.S. Ambassador John Sullivan said, "Justice was not even considered" in this case, and described Trevor's trial as a theater of the absurd. His trial was a sham, and his treatment in the custody of Russian authorities has been nothing short of appalling. He has been denied medical care, consular access, and has been repeatedly moved without proper notification. I would like to sincerely thank Ambassador Sullivan and all of our embassy partners for fighting on Trevor's behalf of his rights and for their close relationship with Trevor's family, while also fighting to bring him home. Trevor has now spent 614 days in Russian prisons on fabricated and false allegations. That is 614 days too long. I spoke with Secretary Blinken, and Ranking Member McCall also spoke with him yesterday. And we'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his support of Trevor Reed and others who are wrongfully detained. Our resolution and our message are simple. The United States will not tolerate an American citizen being held by the Putin regime as a political pawn. And I hope that the Reed family is watching, and if you are, please know that we are committed to bringing Trevor Reed home. I urge my colleagues to join me in standing with Trevor to reunite him with his family. Free Trevor Reed. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Pfluger yields back. I now recognize Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, for holding this markup. These bills and resolutions are important, and I look forward to supporting all of them. I want to thank Representative Pfluger and the Ranking Member for introducing H.Res 186, calling for the release of Trevor Reed. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill. Trevor Reed is a Texan who was unjustly arrested and sentenced to 9 years in prison of prison labor in Russia on trumped-up charges. It's been nearly 2 years since Trevor and his family's nightmare began, and it's long past time for Moscow to release him and allow him to come home to the United States. As this resolution makes clear, we will not stop pressing this issue until Trevor is reunited with his family back in Texas. I also want to highlight the 2 Uyghur measures we'll vote on today. The Ranking Member's resolution reaffirms that the House believes the Chinese government's crimes in Xinjiang constitute genocide. It also calls on the President to direct our UN ambassador to push the United Nations to investigate and take actions against this ongoing genocide. I'm a proud co-sponsor of Mr. McGovern's Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. This bill will ensure that companies choose between relying on forced labor in Xinjiang and having access to the U.S. market. The American people will not be complicit in the Chinese government's abhorrent actions. There are plenty of great bills, obviously, to talk about in this markup, and I could say great things about all of them, but I want to reserve some time to discuss the Global Electoral Exchange Act, which I introduced with Representatives Wagner, Titus, and Fitzpatrick. I'm grateful that we have 19 co-sponsors on this bill, including many members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. In both the 115th and 116th Congresses, we passed the Global Electoral Exchange Act through both this committee and the House during those terms. I'm hopeful that the third time will be the charm in passing it through the United States Senate and finally getting it signed into law. The exchange program this bill creates is even more important now than it was when Mark Meadows and I first introduced it in 2017. Since then, we've seen authoritarian states on the rise and democracy receding. If we're going to compete with adversaries like China and Russia, we need to align with global democracies. The more of them, the better. To do this, we must demonstrate that democracies are capable of meeting the challenges of this century better than authoritarian states. This starts with ensuring democratic states can hold free and fair elections. The Global Electoral Exchange Program fills gaps in existing bilateral election assistance. The exchange program would also enhance ongoing U.S.-funded technical assistance for elections worldwide. Put simply, the United States must exercise leadership in promoting democracy as the best form of government around the world. This is an essential component of any competition with China and Russia, and it's also the right thing to do. That is why this bill is so important in the United States taking a leadership role in the success of democracy around the world. I ask all members to support the Global Electoral Exchange Act today as part of this package. Thank you, Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Castro yields back. I now recognize Representative Peter Meyer of Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McCall for holding this markup. I strongly support the en bloc package, and I just wanted to highlight two bills in particular. The first, as the prior colleagues have mentioned and stood in support of, is House Resolution 186, which is calling on Russia to release Trevor Reed, a Texan and a constituent, Mr. Pfluger's, who has also been a Marine Corps veteran and unjustly detained in that country for over 2 years now. As we all know, Trevor Reed's treatment by the Russian justice system has been a Kafkaesque farce since day one. He was charged with assaulting a police driver and causing his vehicle to swerve, even though an hour of security footage and witness testimony presented at his trial showed no such thing had happened. Our ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, said the evidence against Mr. Reed was so flimsy and preposterous that the entire courtroom, including the judge, audibly laughed when it was presented. For Mr. Reed's ostensible crimes, he was sentenced to a patently harsh and disproportionate punishment of 9 years in prison. We all know what Trevor's real crime was. He was a U.S. citizen and a military veteran. And we know exactly why Russia doled out such an excessive jail sentence, because they wanted him as a bargaining chip in any future negotiations. But Trevor Reed is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to political prisoners in Russia. Paul Whelan, from my home state of Michigan, is another American citizen who's been detained by the Russian government since 2018. Like Trevor Reed, he was imprisoned with no due process and no credible evidence to support his conviction. Passing this resolution sends a clear message to Putin and those he's bought off in their justice system that this type of politically motivated prosecution of U.S. citizens will not stand. I'm proud to support this legislation that calls for Trevor Reed's release, and I will continue to do so for other American citizens, like Michigander Paul Whelan. We must stand united in calling for all political prisoners in Russia's custody to be released immediately. I want to thank Congressman Pfluger again for introducing this resolution, and I'm proud to co-sponsor it. And I also wanted to highlight the Libya Stabilization Act and thank Chairman Deutsch and Ranking Member Wilson of the Middle East Subcommittee for their work on this bill. The Libyan people have seen their homeland destroyed by outside actors intent on expropriating its vast resources and location in North Africa. With rival groups agreeing to a ceasefire and upcoming national elections at the end of this year, we are committed to supporting a peaceful end to the conflict. To that end, I join my colleagues in support of the Libya Stabilization Act to focus on returning to the Libya people that which is theirs. To do that, however, we must ensure that civilian populations and humanitarian aid workers have safe and secure access on the ground. Just yesterday was the 10-year anniversary of Chris Hondros, an American photographer, killed in a mortar attack by pro-Gaddafi forces, reminding us that we need to ensure the safety of bystanders while advancing a resolution to the conflict in Libya. That's why I introduced an amendment to this bill, ensuring that humanitarian demining efforts, alongside the USAID assistance outlined in the bill, are integrated into the overall strategy. The State Department's work alongside allies, partners, and the Libyan people in clearing unexploded ordnance has been critical to stabilization efforts in Libya, and we have to make sure it continues. I've seen firsthand the damage that mines, that leftover unexploded ordnance, UXO, whether it's mortars, rockets, bombs, wreaks tremendous damage on the civilian population and impedes development, stability, and prosperity. And so I'm grateful to Chairman Deutsch for working with me on this amendment, which is a vital piece of bringing back that stability to Libya. I urge the committee to vote yes on the en bloc package, and I yield back. Thank you.
Representative yields back. I now recognize Representative Dina Titus of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Meeks, Ranking Member McCall, for holding this markup and bringing up such important pieces of legislation. I've had the privilege of working on a number of these and co-sponsoring several of the ones before us today. They affect parts of the world that range from Libya to China, from Ukraine to North Korea, showing the broad reach of this committee's jurisdiction and the kinds of issues that we're involved in. I'm especially grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Subcommittee Chairman Castro, Vice Chairwoman Wagner, Congressman Fitzpatrick, and leading the effort on the Global Electoral Exchange Act of 2021. Unfortunately, over the last decade and a half, we have continued to see democratic backsliding around the world. And this has been particularly prevalent in countries where we had been making real progress. And you had seen that starting to take hold against authoritarian rules and regimes. This piece of legislation would support international exchanges of election administrators and officials and others who participate on the private side in the organization and administration of elections, like NGOs in some of these countries. Under this bill, we'll be providing opportunities for individuals from around the world to promote best practices and strengthen electoral institutions. We'll be sending a message that the United States is not going to stand idly by while certain individuals or countries attempt to overturn the democratic process, either at home or in other countries around the world. Instead, we're going to work with our allies and our partners to build more inclusive and ultimately prosperous societies supported by the pillar of free and fair elections, which are the key to a democratic process. In the same vein of supporting open societies and democracy, I'm also proud to be co-sponsoring the CROOK Act, led by Subcommittee Chairman Keating and Ranking Member Fitzpatrick. This bill provides vital resources to support the rule of law and avoid inaction by fledgling democracies. And this inaction can often allow openings for nefarious actors, as we've seen Russia play their part of, that attempt to taint the democratic process. If we allow outside pressure to degrade democratic norms, ultimately state institutions will weaken, potentially crumble, and disappear. This has unfortunately been the case in Libya, where though there has been recent progress towards reversing the course of this failed state, external forces continue to undercut efforts to end the violence and establish a viable path forward for the people of Libya. That's why I'm proud to co-sponsor the Libya Stabilization Act, led by Subcommittee Chairman Deutsch and Ranking Member Wilson. This act sanctions individuals who foster such instability and provides U.S. support for efforts to strengthen democratic and civil society institutions, which are the key to founding democratic governments that will succeed in the future. So we've got to work to end this current humanitarian process. Crisis. Finally, I'm proud to join Ranking Member McCall in co-sponsoring his resolution, which rightfully denotes the current genocide occurring against the Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minorities, and condemns the government of the People's Republic of China. He has spoken more eloquently than I can on this issue. But let me add that the actions of the People's Republic of China as they continue their barbaric treatment of ethnic religious minorities, whether it's Tibetans or ethnic Mongolians. We have to stand with these folks and the Uyghur people, and they joined this long and sad list. This is not anything new to be subjugated and mistreated by the Chinese, and we've got to say enough is enough. This resolution calls on President Biden to urge the global community to do more to stand with us to end this genocide and hold those responsible accountable. I'm pleased to support these measures, and I thank you for bringing them forward, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Young Kim of California, who's the Vice Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mix and Ranking Member McCall. I greatly appreciate your leadership in bringing a number of important bipartisan bills before our committee to consider, many of which I'm honored to co-sponsor. I'm especially happy to see 2 separate measures on the markup addressing the issue of Korean American divided families. Since 1985, the South and North Korean governments have facilitated 21 in-person and 7 video family reunions. Unfortunately, the estimated 100,000 Korean Americans with family members in North Korea have been left out of this process entirely. As a Korean American, I understand and empathize with the great pain many Korean Americans still feel today over the continued separation of their war-torn families in North Korea. For these reasons, I am proud to join bipartisan efforts to right this wrong and allow Korean Americans to visit their family members in North Korea. This includes H.R. 826 from Congresswoman Grace Meng, which I helped introduce earlier this year, and House Resolution 294, which I'm fortunate to co-lead with Congresswoman Karen Bass. I strongly urge my colleagues to pass both resolutions so that we may fulfill the long-held wishes of thousands of Korean Americans today to see their separated families once more. Time is not on their side. Now in their late years, time is running out. And I'm also proud to be a co-sponsor of several measures addressing the atrocities occurring in Xinjiang. Introduced last Congress, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a crucial protection for America's consumers to ensure our people are not purchasing products made with forced labor. Given the ongoing and horrific human rights abuses in Xinjiang, we must give our government the tools it needs to investigate slave labor conditions in China and hold our companies accountable in preventing profits from forced labor. I applaud Congressman McGovern for reintroducing this bill for the 117th Congress and urge speedy passage along with House Resolution 317, a bipartisan resolution led by Chairman and Ranking Member of this committee. This resolution condemns the ongoing genocide against Uyghurs in Xinjiang and urges the President to leverage our power at the United Nations to call for investigation and multilateral sanctions on the People's Republic of China. Over 70 years ago, our country swore never again to ignore genocide and crimes against humanity on the levels we saw during the Holocaust. We must stand together in condemning the human rights abuses and mass sterilizations occurring in Xinjiang and urge our international allies and partners to act as well. I'm proud to co-sponsor this resolution with Ranking Member McCall and Chairman Mix and strongly recommend its passage today. Finally, I'm proud to stand in support of my colleague, Congressman Pfluger's bill calling for the immediate release of Trevor Reed, who is currently serving an unjust sentence of 9 years in a Russian prison camp. Unfortunately, the case of Mr. Reed is not an isolated one. Time and again, Russia has resorted to politically motivated imprisonment to silence critics of the regime. It's a behavior that is unbecoming of a responsible world power. This bill also comes at a crucial time for another prisoner, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who is on the verge of death due to a hunger strike and poor treatment. I'm sure my colleagues and I would join the administration in saying that if Mr. Navalny dies under Russian supervision, there will be swift and dire consequences for Mr. Putin and his government. So I urge the Russian government to respect Mr. Navalny's rights and be treated immediately by a doctor of his choice. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Ted Lieu of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to first thank Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall for holding this markup. I support all the bills and amendments in this package. I'd like to talk about Libya and China. The Libya Stabilization Act, of which I am pleased to be a lead co-sponsor, takes on new importance as a new unity government has taken shape in Libya and the process of national unification moves forward. It is our hope that the provisions of this bill will help to support and sustain Libya's stability, which is critical to the U.S. and our partners. This amendment focuses on another tool that can help stabilize Libya, which is public diplomacy. For years, people-to-people ties between Americans and Libyans were limited. Today, many Libyans are eager to establish ties with the United States, and the amendment is straightforward. First, it states the sense of Congress that the U.S. should expand educational and cultural exchange programs with Libya. And second, it authorizes the president to expand such programs with Libya. Libya's new foreign minister, Najla El-Mangoush, who also happens to be Libya's first female foreign minister, studied in the United States on such a program, which was the Fulbright Scholarship. Her trajectory from Fulbright to foreign minister is but one of countless similar stories of foreign exchange participants who bring their U.S. experience and networks to positions of influence, thereby demonstrating the power of international exchanges and the power of ideas that they learn in America. But there are only currently 3 slots for the Libya Fulbright program each year, and I believe we need to expand those slots as well as the slots in other exchanges. I'm also pleased to support the 2 bills today related to China. The first is H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and the second is H.Res. 317, condemning the ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity being committed against Uyghurs and members of other groups. What China is doing to the Uyghurs is completely unacceptable. They are human beings. Violating the human rights should not be tolerated. And I'm pleased to co-sponsor both of these bills. I also want to take a moment now to talk to my colleagues across the aisle. What China did with the virus at the beginning was completely unacceptable. They lied about it. They suppressed it. They misled the world. At the same time today, another report came out showing this time that 1/3 of Asian Americans fear physical attacks, threats, and violence, and that this violence is rising. Nearly half of Asian Americans experience an incident tied to their racial or ethnic background since the pandemic began. So all of you have the right on the First Amendment to say whatever you want. But if you use an ethnic identifier in talking about this virus, if you use phrases like Kung flu and Chinese virus, you are increasing the risk of violence and hatred towards Americans of Asian descent. So I'm going to plead with you, please stop using those phrases. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Lieu yields back. I now recognize Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. In the previous Congress, this committee and then the entire House passed this legislation by a resounding bipartisan margin with a final tally of 406 votes on the floor of the House. Together, virtually every member of the House, Republicans and Democrats alike, stood together to send an unequivocal message. The use of Uyghur forced labor in corporate supply chains must end right now. Tragically, the United States Senate failed to pass this legislation on their end. Now we have another opportunity, and those of us serving in both chambers must act with the moral urgency that this issue demands. By banning all imports with content from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, unless the relevant company can prove that its product was not made with forced labor. This legislation would mark a long overdue step on the path toward ending mass human rights violations against the Uyghur people. This is a step our nation can take right now to end the genocide. I have met with constituents in my community who have been personally affected by the Chinese government's actions, including a Uyghur woman whose mother has been detained in northwest China. I assured these constituents that I would do everything within my power to protect their loved ones, and I intend to fulfill that commitment. As officials in the United States and in democratic nations around the globe work together to seek an end to these horrific abuses, it is imperative that all corporations, no matter how powerful, are held to the basic standard of not using the forced labor of detained women, men, and children. By passing this provision into law, the United States can lead the way toward ensuring respect for the fundamental rights and dignity of the Uyghur people. In this effort, I am proud to stand not just with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but also with the AFL-CIO and all members of the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition. This broad coalition of labor, civil society, and elected officials is sending a powerful signal. The struggle for human rights and dignity knows no boundaries. In the words of Dr. King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Together, we can shape a future of rights and dignity for all. Let's pass this bill, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Andy Levin of Michigan, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. And I support so many of the important pieces of legislation that we're considering. I want to focus my remarks today on the Haiti Development, Accountability, and Institutional Transparency Initiative Act, H.R. 2471. I especially want to thank the bill's sponsor, Hakeem Jeffries, the gentleman from New York, for his work on this. As someone who's fought for accountability and respect for human rights in Haiti for a long time, I'm super pleased about the steps that this bill takes. I'm also glad that we're making an unambiguous statement about the current state of affairs in Haiti, acknowledging that the Moïse administration lacks the credibility to oversee a proposed constitutional referendum scheduled for June, which legal experts consider unconstitutional, and recognizing the widespread concerns among Haitian civil society groups of all kinds that planned elections will not be free, will not be fair, and will not be credible. This bill makes clear that the United States should not support this dubious constitutional referendum, and that we should instead empower Haitian civil society, grassroots organizations, and diaspora groups to chart a Haitian-led path forward out of the current political crisis. Again, thanks to you, Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, for making Haiti a priority in the early months of this new Congress. Thanks to Chairman Jeffries for his leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2471, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Levin yields back. I now recognize Representative Sarah Jacobs of California, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm looking forward to voting for and supporting all of the bills today. And I especially want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for elevating the topic of Haiti and the United States' role in it. I'd like to thank you and Ranking Member McCall and my colleagues for their support of my amendment to H.R. 2471, the Haiti Development, Accountability, and Institutional Transparency Initiative Act. I also want to thank Congressman Issa, who has joined me as a partner on this amendment. This is a critical bill that will ensure we take stock of U.S. policy in Haiti and measure our progress in addressing corruption, governance, rule of law, press freedoms, and so much more. Haiti is currently facing one of its worst outbreaks of violence since 1986. This has had a devastating impact on the Haitian people, and not addressing it makes it impossible to find a solution to resolving longstanding instability. We've seen this movie before, and instead of continuing the same approach and hoping for a different outcome, it's critical that as we're conducting our long overdue review of policy, we are analyzing the drivers and risks of conflict, instability, and violence in Haiti. My amendment sets out to do just that. It requires the State Department and USAID to conduct an assessment of conflict, instability, and violence in Haiti. It ensures we're analyzing the systemic patterns and causes of violence and the role of actors and beneficiaries who play a part. It also takes into account the lack of judicial independence in Haiti, a key factor aggravating political instability and distrust in government institutions. As someone who's worked in conflict stabilization at the State Department, I know how important it is that we understand and address the root causes of violence and conflict in order to craft sound policy and make decisions on where to focus our foreign assistance. My amendment will ensure our review of U.S. policy in Haiti takes this important step. And with that, I support this bill and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Jacobs yields back. Does anyone wish to speak on the en bloc? Hearing no further requests for recognition, the committee will proceed to consider the notice items en bloc. Pursuant to the previous order, the question occurs on the measures en bloc as amended, if amended. We're going to take a vote by voice. All members, please unmute your microphones. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business today, and I again want to thank Ranking Member McCall and all of the committee members on both sides of the aisle for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. This markup is now adjourned.